You order a coffee, you walk up to the counter, you tell them your order, you wait, they hand you a cup. Then the tablet swivels towards you 20%, 25%, 30%, and there it is. That feeling. The screen staring at you, the barista right there, the people behind you in line, the quiet pressure of a moment that was not supposed to be this complicated. You didn't sit down, nobody took your order, nobody refilled anything. You placed a $7 coffee order, and now you're being asked to add $2.10 before you've even touched the cup. You hit custom amount, you type in zero, you feel guilty about it for the rest of the morning. That is tipping culture in 2025, and nearly 9 in 10 Americans say it has gone too far. But here's what nobody explains. The guilt you feel at that tablet is not an accident. It was designed. The system behind it is decades old, it runs on federal law, and it has almost nothing to do with rewarding good service. Let's start with what people are actually feeling right now. Americans spent $283 on pressure-driven tips in 2025, down 38% from the $453 they reluctantly handed over in 2024. People are pushing back not because they've stopped caring about workers, but because the pressure has become impossible to ignore. 72% of U.S. adults say tipping is expected in more places today than it was 5 years ago. 5 years ago, you didn't get a tip prompt at a self-checkout kiosk. You didn't get asked to tip at an airport convenience store. You didn't get a QR code in a hotel room asking you to tip for housekeeping that was already built into your $300 a night rate. Yelp reviews mentioning tipflation increased 399% from May 2023 to April 2024. That's not a trend. That's an eruption, and yet the average tip has been quietly dropping. Average tips at quick service restaurants declined from a pandemic high of 5% in 2021 to 15.8% in Q3 2024. The average tip on Square's digital food and beverage transactions fell to 14.9% in Q2 2025 from 15.5% in 2023. People are still tipping. They're just tipping less, feeling worse about it, and increasingly asking the question that the industry would rather you not ask. Why is this my job? To understand why, you have to go back further than you think. Tipping did not start in America. It came from medieval Europe, a custom where servants received extra money from aristocrats for particularly attentive service. When wealthy Americans traveled to Europe in the 1800s, they brought the practice back home with them. But here's where it got complicated. Tipping diminished across Europe in the 1860s, but continued in the United States, where it was especially favored by employers who sought to avoid paying workers, particularly those newly liberated from slavery. After the Civil War, the railroad and hospitality industries, led by companies like the Pullman Company, hired newly freed black workers and paid them little to no base wage. The tip replaced the paycheck. It's the legacy of slavery that turned the tip in the United States from a bonus or extra on top of a wage to a wage itself, as one labor researcher put it. By 1880, 43% of workers in hotels and restaurants were black, doing 13 to 14-hour days, almost entirely dependent on the whims of customers for their income. The system wasn't a courtesy. It was a mechanism for keeping labor cheap and a specific group of workers economically subordinate. America's anti-tipping movement tried to fight back. In the early 1900s, several states actually passed laws banning tipping outright. Georgia, Iowa, Mississippi, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Washington among them. The argument was that tipping was demeaning, that it created a servant class, and that it was fundamentally incompatible with a democratic society. The restaurant industry lobbied those laws away. And the tipping system not only survived, it got codified into federal law. The Fair Labor Standards Act established a bare minimum floor for tipped wages only in 1966. For the first time, tipped workers had to be paid something. But the law came with a catch called the tip credit. Here's how it works. The federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, but if you work a job where you receive tips, your employer is only required to pay you $2.13 an hour, as long as your tips make up the difference. If you don't make enough in tips to hit $7.25, your employer is supposed to cover the gap. In practice, that almost never gets enforced or verified. The federal tipped minimum wage has remained at $2.13 an hour since 1991. That is over 30 years without a single increase. In those same 30 years, the cost of housing, food, healthcare, and childcare has roughly doubled or tripled in most American cities, but the base wage your server is legally entitled to from their employer has not moved 1 cent. The original split between the regular minimum wage and the tipped minimum wage was meant to be 50-50, but that was severed when a 1996 amendment to the Fair Labor Standards Act froze the tipped minimum at $2.13 in perpetuity. So what does that mean in practice? It means that in states like Alabama, Texas, and Utah, employers pay only 29.4% of tipped workers' wages. Customers cover the other 70.6% through tips. In Delaware, tips account for 85.1% of wages, while employers are only responsible for paying a cash wage that represents just 14.9% of the state's minimum wage. That is not a tip. That is a paycheck that your employer legally offloaded onto you. And here is the part that should make you pause. When that tablet swivels towards you and asks for 25%, it is not a polite request for a reward for exceptional service. It is the mechanism by which a profitable business shifts its labor costs to its customers and relies on your guilt and social discomfort to collect. Now, here's where it gets more recent. The iPad era changed everything. Before touchscreen point-of-sale systems, tipping required actual friction. You had to pick up a pen, calculate a percentage, write a number. The discomfort was distributed. The customer had to actively do something to tip and actively do something to not tip. The tablet removed that friction entirely. It defaults to a tip. Skipping it requires you to tap through screens, make an active choice against the suggested amounts, and do it in front of an employee who can see exactly what you're selecting. About 66% of consumers say they sometimes or always feel pressured to tip when a digital interface asks them to, even when it's just a takeout coffee order. Only about a third of Americans say it's easy to know whether or how much to tip for various services, and the confusion is real and intentional. Companies benefit from uncertainty because confused customers tend to over-tip rather than risk social judgment. The suggested amounts on those screens are not neutral. Defaulting to 20% as the lowest option nudges you towards spending more than you intended. Some screens don't even show a dollar amount. They show percentages because percentages feel smaller than actual numbers. 20% on a $40 restaurant bill sounds reasonable. $8 added to a to-go order you're eating in your car does not. This is behavioral psychology in service of a business model. And the companies that built these point-of-sale systems know exactly what they're doing. The default tip amounts are not chosen randomly. They are A/B tested. The screens are designed to collect maximum revenue from social pressure, not to help workers. And it expanded fast. The tip screen spread from sit-down restaurants to fast casual, then to coffee shops, then to food trucks, then to hotel rooms, then to self-checkout counters where you bag your own groceries. There is no logic to where it stops because it doesn't stop on its own. It stops when customers push back hard enough. The speed of expansion tells you something important. These screens didn't spread because customers demanded them. They spread because the technology made it easier for businesses to collect tips, and because adding a tip prompt costs a business nothing while adding meaningful revenue on every transaction. A coffee shop that does 300 transactions a day with an average order of $7 that successfully guilt trips 40% of customers into a $1.40 tip. That's $168 a day in wages transferred from customers to workers that the employer doesn't have to pay. About $60,000 a year per location in labor cost shifted to your discomfort. This is why the tip prompt isn't going away on its own. It is too profitable to abandon voluntarily. So who actually gets hurt when the system breaks down? This is the most important part, and the part that gets lost in the debate. When people stop tipping, or tip less, the money doesn't flow back to the worker who didn't get it. It doesn't go toward higher menu prices that fund better wages. It just disappears from the worker's income. People working for tips are more likely, 46%, to rely on some form of public assistance than non-tipped working people at 35.5%. In the restaurant industry alone, over 27% of Black workers live in poverty. About 37% of tipped workers are mothers, and nearly half of these women are single mothers. States where tipped workers are paid the full minimum wage, not $2.13, have a poverty rate of 10% among service workers. States using the $2.13 tipped wage have a poverty rate of 18% among the same workers. The worker did not design this system. The server did not lobby Congress to freeze the tipped minimum at $2.13. The barista did not install the tablet software that defaults to 25%. They are as trapped in this model as the customer is, just on the more economically precarious side of it. The anger directed at the tip screen is legitimate. The problem is that when it gets expressed by leaving zero on a tip line, it lands on the wrong person. So, what do you actually do with all of this? First, understand what you're actually deciding when you tip. When the service is table service at a sit down restaurant, tipping at or above 20% is one of the most direct ways to close the gap between what an employer pays and what a worker can actually live on. That is the original context tipping was designed for. Not great, not fair, but the context in which workers built their income expectations and took the job. A server at a busy restaurant on a Saturday night might take home $200 in tips. A slow Tuesday? Maybe $40. Their rent doesn't change with the traffic. When the service is counter service, you walk up, place an order, pick it up. The context is different. Workers in those environments often receive higher base wages than tipped table service workers because they aren't protected by the same $2.13 loophole. Tipping is appreciated, but it is genuinely optional in a way it is not at sit-down restaurants. The social pressure of the swiveling tablet is real. The moral obligation is not the same. Second, the most powerful thing you can do has nothing to do with the tip line. 8 states have already eliminated the tipped minimum wage entirely. In Alaska, California, Minnesota, Montana, Nevada, Oregon, and Washington, employers pay tipped workers the full minimum wage, and tips are on top of that, not instead of it. Tipped industries in those states have higher growth, less inequality, and lower poverty for all workers. The states that changed this did it because enough people understood the system and demanded something different, not because enough people hit no tip on enough tablets. Skipping the tip is a protest against an invisible system. Voting to change the tipped minimum wage is a direct hit to the mechanism that built it. Third, support businesses that opted out of the tip model entirely. No tip restaurants and service-included pricing establishments pay workers higher base wages and build the cost into menu prices. The bill is higher, the experience is more transparent, and workers report more stable income and fewer instances of harassment because their paycheck doesn't depend on customer behavior. Some restaurants are experimenting with service-included pricing, where gratuity is factored into menu prices. No-tip restaurants report more equitable work environments and better service because staff aren't dependent on customer whims. When those restaurants exist near you, choose them. Their higher menu prices are the honest version of what you were paying anyway, just without the guilt trip at the end. Here's what the tipping debate keeps getting wrong. It treats this as a cultural problem about manners, expectations, entitlement, social pressure. It isn't. It's a labor policy problem with a 130-year history, a federal law that hasn't been updated since 1991, and a technology layer that made the pressure impossible to escape. The guilt you feel at that tablet is real. The confusion about when and how much to tip is real. The resentment when you're asked to tip at a self-checkout kiosk is completely justified. But the server who makes $2.13 an hour before tips is real too. Both things are true at the same time. The customer is not wrong to be frustrated. The worker is not wrong to need the money. The employer who built a business model on $2.13 an hour and a guilt-driven tablet is the one who constructed this situation. and has been doing so with federal permission since 1991. The reason this keeps getting framed as a cultural debate about whether you're a good or bad person based on your tip percentage is because that framing benefits the only party that isn't part of the conversation. As long as the debate is between customers and workers, nobody is looking at the employer. As long as servers are angry at customers for tipping 15% instead of 20%, nobody is organizing against the system that pays servers $2.13 an hour. As long as you feel guilty at a tablet, the question of whether the business should just pay its workers never gets asked. That's not an accident either. Understanding that doesn't make the tablet less awkward, but it changes who you're frustrated at. The screen is the symptom, the wage is the system, and the system, as always, was designed. Have you changed how you tip in the last year? Less, more, or stopped entirely in certain situations? And did learning about the $2.13 tipped minimum wage change anything about how you see that tablet? Drop it in the comments. The best ones become the next video. Subscribe to Designed Economy, new video every day. Next, why your rent keeps going up, even when your landlord swears they're not being greedy.